Oh, Captain, going out to check for them orcs now, you know what I'm saying, bro? We're supposed to say some words here. Whoa! Captain, don't worry, I will get back your cupcakes from them.
A few moments ago.
Hi, this is Groundeffected, and my name is your dad, and you just watched what I think is probably the world's first fully remote control working Space Marine Invader ATV ever, I think. If it's not obvious at this point, this video is obviously going to be about how I made this little cupcake carrying Space Marine invading remote control vehicle. And the first thing you're going to need to do if you ever decide to do one of these is pretty much build the thing. I try not to glue too much because at this point you don't want anything to be stuck together in case you need to remove it or even turn it into a hatch of some kind. The first thing I decided to do was hack away bits in order to make the steering work on this ATV. I started hacking it away, knowing full and well that I would need to at least 3D design a new arm for the wheel to go into. And this is where I started to come across some of the first problems. The kits are obviously not designed to be turned into remote control vehicles, so some of the geometry definitely does not work the way it needs to. I made a couple of brass shims, I don't know, it's a couple of brass things that slide inside of each other that act as some kind of a bearing. It's basically a bushing. I just taught myself something. Anyway, this is how I design things. I just use Tinkercad. I'm not clever enough to use anything other than Tinkercad, and then once I've got what it looks roughly like the thing I need, I then 3D print it on my favorite printing machine, which currently is the Uniformation GK2, link in description. Once I've got my print out and I've queued it and I've done a couple of tests, bear in mind that I'm not going to show you all of the tests that I did, but there was some issues of fitment, and that was the fact that these things just don't fit in there. So I decided to redesign all of these things later on, and I will show you that when we get to that part of the video. When I was fitting these bushings, if you do ever do something like this, a kind of trick that you might want to be able to use is that before you cure it, if you push these things in, they fit really snug, and then when you cure it, it kind of shrinks on it and it's never coming out after that, ever. I like to use a Sharpie or a very fine line permanent marker pen to draw onto the model before I start chopping things away. But essentially, when you're making one of these conversions, you are going to chop a lot of plastic away, and yes, it's going to hurt at sometimes, and you probably will cut something you shouldn't cut. Also, please make sure to wear your protective glasses, because these bits shoot everywhere, and when you warm it up very nicely with your Dremel, that hot fire plastic going in your eyeball is not something you want to do on a Friday afternoon. For the servo, I just used an Orlandoo Hunter servo. I don't know exactly the specifications of this. All I know is that this servo specifically is a low voltage servo, which is going to come to bite me in the butt later on, and I'll try to explain it when we get there. I used one of the screws that I found in my massive bucket of screws, which, trust me, if you make remote control things, you need at least 4 billion screws in a little Tupperware somewhere in your cupboard, because one day you will need them. Here is another one of the mistakes that I made, and I know I'm showing you all of the mistakes that I made, but bear in mind, when I filmed this, this is what I thought was actually going to be the final product. So if you are copying this or going to try to attempt this, ignore everything you see for the next few minutes, other than the general build of the model, because there was issues with the steering, and I will talk about that later on as well. For the wheels, I needed to make sure that they spun very well, and there was an issue with the stock wheels on this particular one. I don't know why, but they just wouldn't fit. Everything I made for it, it would either end up looking too big, the arm would look like it was way too big, and then so I ended up just making my own wheels, which meant that I had to squish the wheel just slightly, but it visually looks almost the same as the stock wheels. I really wanted to use the stock wheels, and in hindsight, I probably should have just used Lego wheels, because these wheels have absolutely no grip, but that does lead for some really cool drifting around my studio. Then got to cutting a little bit more on the model. At the back of the model, I knew I was going to need space for the axle. Little did I know that this space was going to be very important later on. but for now I just cut off the little base plate that the man is standing on, and I made my own little base plate, and I stuck this into the bottom after shortening the sides of that little bucket at the back. If you are interested in the files for this model, or to convert this model basically, I will make them available, just not currently. It depends on when you're watching this video, obviously, but if you are watching it on the day of release, they will not be available yet, but I will get them up on my website as soon as I can, and there'll be a link for that in the description below. There is a lot more cutting out to do. Don't think that you are done cutting out stuff, but basically anything on the inside of the model I can pretty much cut away because you won't really see it. So I'm going to take advantage of that extra space, and I'm going to cut away as much of those inside mudguard flaps as I possibly can in order to get some good clearance for me to be able to move the wheels in and out without having to take off the whole mudguard. This means that I can glue it together, and once it's glued together, it makes it easier for me to have a couple of separate parts that make up the buggy, which all still come apart in 4 separate bits, which makes it easier. This is the axle that I designed. It is essentially just a tube where I stuck a piece of carbon fiber rod down the center of it, and I was going to put on a little pulley in the middle and use an elastic to run from the motor that I had placed inside of the vehicle. Originally, the motor that I had used was taken out of a servo, and I knew that I was doing something stupid, but I didn't quite believe that I was that dumb, and I really believed that this motor would have the power to push this. And it doesn't. Spoiler alert, it definitely doesn't, but I will show you what I ended up doing in the end. You may notice that there was a resin color change and that it is now green. There is no difference between this and what I was using previously, other than this was maybe perhaps a little bit more ABS like resin that was mixed into this green than in the grey one. I then took everything over to George because I was having major issues. I couldn't get power to the servo, I couldn't get power to the receiver. I eventually had to speak to someone from TBS because I was just being a schmuck, and I actually reset my receiver, and then I couldn't get it to bond, and then I had it in some kind of failsafe mode. Anyway, I eventually got it going, but over at George, we sat and wired everything up. I should have actually
not bridged the connectors. You should solder them well without bridging. Sorry, solder. Sorry.
Yes, that's the problem, is because I was trying to solder them and I wasn't actually soldering. Let me solder. And once I had soldered everything together and it actually made connection, we finally got connection to the receiver, which is great news. It also means that I had connection to the motor, but for some reason nothing to the servo, and at this point I hadn't realized the mistake that I had made yet. And that mistake comes in the form of nerd maths, which I generally just tend to ignore other than my own personal experiences and just going off gut feel. But this time my gut failed me. The problem was that the battery that I had made was a 2-cell. This means it's 7.2 volts. Actually, it's 8.6 volts when it's fully charged. So it is not necessarily a high voltage, but the servo that is attached to this entire setup, maximum voltage is 4.2, and it generally wants to run between 2.4 volts and 4.2 volts. So basically I super cooked the servo. It was dying this entire time that it was plugged in, and I didn't even realize that that was what was essentially happening. So yes, that's what I did. I burnt the servo. But during this whole time, I was not wondering why the servo was not working. I just thought that I had absolutely not correctly set up my radio, meaning that all I needed to do now was paint this thing, put it all together, set up my radio, and everything would be absolutely perfectly fine. Things were not fine, however, over in Space Marine ATV land, because what I had done was cook the servo, but during this time I had not figured this out, and I was speaking to one Mr. Doc Brown Miniatures. He is a very, very clever man that actually knows a lot more than I know about any of these things, and so we came up with a little bit of a discussion, to which we discussed lowering the voltage with these things. I can't even remember what these things are called, but this is a shout out to Mr. Dr. Brown Miniatures. He is a very clever man. Please check him out in the Instagram. I will leave a description for him. This didn't work, so I scrapped all of that and I stopped filming because I started to panic. And I only started filming again later once I had already installed a new servo and figured out why I was being a schmuck all along. Basically, I just needed to step it down, and the step down that I used was just a step down unit from Orlandoo, and I will leave a full description of all the parts that I used so you can look at it for yourself. But essentially, I just used a speed controller that was smaller and had the right power output for the servo, and Bob is your uncle. Also, you may notice that things have changed on this rear axle. I had to bin the other one because I glued it all together, obviously, but I decided to go with a gear on the back of the axle towards the wheel, and I took an Orlandoo freaking motor and I just glued that underneath. Thank God I lifted that platform though, because it would not have fitted otherwise. Once I had got it all glued in and soldered up, all I had to do was plug it in and call the model done.
Captain, going out to check for them orcs now, you know what I'm saying, right? We're supposed to say some words here. Captain, don't worry, I will get back your cupcakes from them. Yeah, definitely sounds like there is something wrong with their vehicle. Don't worry, I got them. I just knocked over your sister's barriers for the garden. Get one of the psychics to convince them that their vehicle no longer works. Quick, I need to stop them. This is Sparkle Blue Boy 69. The Imperium has now been saved. There is no more need to worry about cupcakes being taken by green things. Oh, what's that? Another one!
Groundeffected toys not sold separately, including batteries are not sold separately. You cannot get these toys. Check out description.